Continuation of Chapter 7. Fourth part, Degrees of Liberalism. Having finished the third part, the Pope recapitulates, quote, "And now, to reduce for clearness' sake to its principal heads all that has been set forth with its immediate conclusions, the summing up in this briefly, that man, by a necessity of his nature, is wholly subject to the most faithful and ever-enduring power of God, and that, as a consequence, any liberty, except that which consists in submission to God and in subjection to his will, is unintelligible. To deny the existence of this authority in God, or to refuse to submit to it, means to act, not as a free man, but as one who treasonably abuses his liberty. And in such a disposition of mind, the chief and deadly vice of liberalism essentially consists." End quote. Here the Pope puts his finger on the wound. The evil is to refuse to recognize the sovereignty of God, the laws of God. One no longer wants God to intervene in human affairs, as he did by our Lord Jesus Christ. But one must submit oneself to this intervention of Jesus Christ. One must recognize his reign. Such is the fundamental principle that the Pope reiterates. The Deadly Sin of Liberalism. In the fourth and last part of the encyclical, the Pope identifies more precisely what the capital sin of liberalism consists in. It is, he says, this disposition of the soul that leads a man to deny the sovereignty of God and to refuse to submit to it. This is, in fact, the essence of liberalism. When one glances at the moral and social consequences of such a stance, one is frightened with good reason. Yet it is also well to remember that for at least 12 centuries after the period of persecutions, the good God was served and recognized in the great majority of the European states. And with the conversion of the Indians of South America, there was a hope that the entire world would submit to our Lord Jesus Christ, to the truth, and thus live by a supernatural spirit as God wanted. The break occurred at the time of the Protestant revolt, but even before, with the Renaissance, the cult of man had appeared on the scene with the cult of pagan civilizations. All this developed like a cancer on a body. Soon the revolt became generalized, sometimes bloody, and how many Catholics were the victims of it? Then society became laic, without God, against God, secularized. What is meant by the word secularized, if not the complete loss of faith? In a totally profane society, the dimension of the faith disappears, and everything that the faith commands also disappears. Then, logically, necessarily, the Spirit was to penetrate inside the Church, and it too, especially since the Council, became secularized. Priests lose their faith in grace and in the sacraments. The inward reality disappears behind the exterior rites, become purely formalistic. Who has helped spread these errors? It was precisely the liberal Catholics who were fascinated by these ideas of liberty, liberty against the authority of God. We are witnessing now the destruction of civil society, the family, and the church. It behooves us to find out the cause, and it is this deeply ingrained error of liberalism, which is, basically, the same error as Protestantism, and which developed by the action of Freemasonry. Liberalism, as with every disease, has diverse degrees, but it is always a serious illness. Once one calls into question the authority of God over men and society, there is no reason to stop or draw a line. If one denies to our Lord Jesus Christ a certain domain, the others will soon be contested as well. First degree, absolute liberalism. Pope Leo XIII then precisely identifies the various degrees of liberalism. Quote, "In more ways than one can the will depart from the obedience which is due to God, or to those who share the divine power. For to reject the supreme authority of God, and to cast off all obedience to him in public matters, or even in private and domestic affairs, is the greatest perversion of liberty and the worst kind of liberalism, and what we have said must be understood to apply to this alone in its fullest sense." End quote. This first degree is doctrinaire liberalism, such as the Freemasons espouse, and the complete putting into practice of which is envisaged by socialism and communism. Second degree, the Church despoiled or reduced in status. Quote, "Next comes the system of those who admit indeed the duty of submitting to God, the Creator and Ruler of the world, inasmuch as all nature is dependent on his will, but who boldly reject all laws of faith and morals which are above natural reason, but are revealed by the authority of God." End quote. These then accept natural religion, but not supernatural religion. They reject revelation, and so doing, they reject the Church, which represents revelation, the deposit of faith, and the transmission of that deposit. Ultimately, this is also to reject our Lord, who instituted the Church as distinct from the state. Among those who are against the influence of the Church in civil society, the Pope distinguishes two attitudes. There are those who refuse categorically to recognize the Church as a society which must exert an influence in civil society. For them, quote, "they would pay no more regard to the Church than if she did not exist, and, at most, would allow the citizens individually to attend to their religion in private, if so minded." End quote. In short, theirs is an attitude of complete contempt of the Church and of revelation, the putting into act of which results in the despoliation of the Church and the suppression of her institutions. There is also the attitude of those who agree to consider the Church as a society, but as no different from other societies, thus as a religious association without any exclusive prerogative, and without the nature of a perfect society, with the right to own property, to administer and govern her members, and to teach freely. Quote, "They aggrandize the power of the civil government to such extent as to subject the Church of God to the empire and sway of the state, like any voluntary association of citizens." End quote. This is, in fact, what happens to the Church in many countries. In France, for example, the state does not recognize the Church as a society with right of ownership. It only recognizes it to cultural associations which can own the property in each diocese. Even the Society of St. Pius X was obliged to create cultural associations in order to legally own its property. The liberals find this normal, because there are also associations of Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, etc. In the states with which a concordat is in effect, as in Germany and Italy, the Church is recognized as a society owning the diocesan property, but not as the one true religious society founded by our Lord. There is no longer any state whose constitution states that only the Catholic religion is publicly, officially recognized by the state. The last state to have suppressed such a clause was Ireland. Third degree, liberal Catholics. There remains one last category, that of liberal Catholics. These are practicing Catholics who think that they do well by saying that the Church should march in step with the times. They do not all approve of the separation of Church and State, but they think that it is necessary to bring the Church, quote, to adapt herself to the times and conform to what is required by the modern system of government, end quote. This is how the Pope judges this proposition. Quote, such an opinion is sound if it is to be understood of some equitable adjustment consistent with truth and justice, insofar, namely, that the Church, in the hope of some great good, may show herself indulgent, and may conform to the times insofar as her sacred office permits. But it is not so in regard to practices and doctrines which a perversion of morals and a warped judgment have unlawfully introduced. Religion, truth, and justice must ever be maintained, and as God has entrusted these great and sacred matters to the care of the Church, she can never be so unfaithful to her office as to dissemble in regard to what is false or unjust, or to connive at what is hurtful to religion. End quote. The liberal Catholics make a rule of the exception. By the very fact, they destroy the rule. The Church concedes that temporarily she cannot act otherwise when she cannot go against the state. She accepts a concordat, and she maintains relations with a state even if it does not consider the Catholic religion as the only recognized religion. But nonetheless, as soon as possible, she must seek the means to be in a situation that accords with the truth. She only tolerates provisionally being placed on a par with other religions. As for the liberal Catholics, they find this situation to be normal. It is impossible to regain the influence that was enjoyed during the Middle Ages, they say. It is quite acceptable for society to be secular. Here one finds the theory of Jacques Maritain that society must develop. Once it was religious, but with time and progress and the change of mindset, it is normal that society should become irreligious. Behold how the combat is abandoned, whereas it is as necessary as ever to affirm and uphold the social reign of our Lord Jesus Christ, without which there can never be peace or liberty or the salvation of souls. So it is, and there is no room for beating about the bush.